Brothers and sisters, welcome back to this discussion on the book of Revelation. This is the 12th session, and we have two more to go after this one. Last time we talked about Revelation 20, and I gave an interpretation of this chapter, which is quite different from the prevailing interpretation of chapter 20. And I don't know whether you think that is reasonable, but today I'm going to talk more about how people would read Revelation 20, and I have to do this because otherwise it will be very confusing, because I present a story and without showing how my story would differ from the interpretation of other people, then there are different elements coming into this picture, and it will be, and well, for people who haven't really spent a lot of time in trying to understand what the millennium is about, this will be utmost confusing. So I'm going to spend this session talking about my interpretation and how it differs from the prevailing understanding. And I am saying that all the other understandings are right here. And so, okay, so let me try to recap what Revelation 20 is about basically. Now, first of all, it talks about an angel coming down from heaven with a chain in his hand, and he binds Satan and for 1,000 years, preventing him from deceiving the nations. And then some saints, some people who have been beheaded would resurrect and reign with Christ for 1,000 years. Now, this 1,000 years is the millennium. And then after that, Satan is let out for a little while, and Satan would deceive the nations, and the nations would come from the four corners of the world, and they would besiege the camp of the saints. And thereafter, Satan is defeated. Fire would come down from heaven to destroy the opposition, and Satan would be thrown into the lake of fire and brimstone. And then comes the last judgment. So this basically is what chapter 20 talks about. Now, there are basically three views of this 1,000 years, which people would call the millennium, okay? So there is this pre-millennialism, post-millennialism, or post-millennial view, and a millennial view. Now, what are these millennial views? I have taken this picture just from the internet, and this is everywhere. So let me start with post-millennium, or the post-millennial view. Now, I just have to say that all these millennial views do have certain things in common. The first thing in common is that they bring in the second coming of Christ. And that I'll say a little bit more about this later on. But without this another reference point, if you will, the second coming of Christ, okay, there will be no millennial view. So what is this? Now, I do not deny that Jesus has told us that he would come again. So people would say, well, when Jesus came to this earth, that was his first coming. And when he comes again, that is his second coming. And so let us try to see whether this makes sense. When we read the 4th verse of chapter 20, it says, "Then I saw thrones, and seated on them were those who had been given authority to judge. I also saw the souls of those who had been beheaded because of the testimony," and so on. "And they came to life and reigned with Christ for 1,000 years. Now, they came to life, they lived, okay, in the original text. And then 2 verses later, it said, and they will reign with him, that is Christ, for 1,000 years. When you read this, do you see Christ going away and was absent for a little while, and then now he reappears? He comes back and reigns with the saints? Well, I don't see it here. The sense it conveys here is that Christ has always been around. Christ is ever present, okay? And indeed, the major actors, major protagonists in this chapter are God, the saints, and the opposition. And Christ is not the major actor. He would be reigning with the saints, but he does not take an active role in this chapter. And this is what one has to consider. So I don't see that Christ would be gone for whatever number of years, and he would return, and then he would collect the saints and say, hey, come and reign with me. The saints simply lived and reign with the ever-present sovereign, that is Christ. Now, so if you search through the whole chapter, you cannot find the sense that Jesus is coming again in Revelation 20. I'm not denying that Jesus would come again, but is this passage talking about Jesus' second coming? Well, you be the judge, but as far as I'm concerned, I don't see it. Now, so let us go to the other views, premillennialism. So it also shares this, what I call extra context, extra Revelation 20 element, the second coming of Christ. But it also adds something to this chapter, which is not here in this chapter, and which is not even here in the book of Revelation. That's called the tribulation. Now, what is the tribulation? The tribulation is the belief that at certain point in our history, the entire world will go through a period of tremendous difficulty, of tremendous misery. And some people say that this will happen for 7 years or figuratively for 7 years. So for how long, we don't know, okay? This element is not in the book of Revelation, and I will say a little bit more about that. And then on top of this addition, there is another element which is even further away from the Bible. It's called the rapture. And so with this rapture, this tribulation would be split up into 2 parts, okay? And according to some understanding, this so-called rapture would happen before the tribulation. The rapture may happen in the middle of this tribulation and also after the tribulation. So it splinters, the tribulation is splintered into 3 parts. What is the rapture? The rapture is the belief that that Christ would come and welcome the saints to him in heaven. And so the saints on this earth will all of a sudden disappear. I don't know how, okay? And they will be taken up to meet heaven to be with Christ. And somehow they would come back to this earth and reign with Christ. And that starts the 1,000 years that Christ is supposed to be reigning with the saints, according to Revelation 20. So they have brought in all this information. However, first of all, let us take a look at this Great Tribulation claim. Now, when we went through the 7 seals, and when we came to the 6th seal, we encountered this Great Tribulation. And within the context, we find that this Great Tribulation is nothing But all the miseries that creation will have to go through because of human misdeeds, from the time of Adam, from the time the first human sinned, and then Cain murdered Abel, and so on and so forth, with the propagation of sin, the entire created order of God has suffered tremendously. And it continues to suffer until the last sinner exists on this earth, until the last unrepentant sinner continues to sin and wreak havoc on this earth. And that, the sum total of all this havoc that sinners would bring on creation would constitute the Great Tribulation. And that is reading the text within the proper context. So the Great Tribulation has been debunked. Okay. Now, and then what is the rapture? The rapture is escapism. It is actually quite anti-Bible because the church will have to go through the suffering. In fact, the church will have to suffer in order to redeem and in order to bring salvation to this world. There's no escaping. Jesus has not promised that we will be spared the suffering. We will have to suffer. The church will have to suffer. The Christians will have to suffer. But there seems to be flimsy support in First Thessalonians chapter 4. When Paul talks about people being or meeting Christ up in heaven or in the middle. According to this scholar, well-known, respected scholar, N.T. Wright, Paul is using an imagery because in those days, when the king goes out to conquer or to fight against another kingdom and to conquer, after his victory, he would come back to his own city. And the citizens of that city would open the gate of the city and would go out to meet the king halfway. And when they meet the king, they would bring him back to the city and rejoice and celebrate. And that is the imagery that Paul was using in our relation to Christ. And Christ will be coming from heaven. Now, heaven is not exactly physical, but if you imagine heaven to be up there, okay, we would be meeting Christ up in, well, mid-heaven, and then we would be bringing him down to earth. But that is just an imagery, okay? And there's really no other support of the rapture because people can quote all kinds of things to really tax our imagination. And I don't think rapture is biblical at all. So that has prompted very good scholars and Christian leaders to call the rapture and possibly the Great Tribulation Christian pornography. Now, I think this is quite appropriate because, okay, sex is a good thing. Sex is created by God as beautiful. But if you pervert it and try to sell it as pornography, then you're completely perverting the entire thing. And yes, God wants us to be sheltered in Him so that we can be renewed and we will have strength to fight another day against the onslaught of Satan. But when you think that we can escape the tribulation, that is complete nonsense, okay? And that is escapism versus God giving us consolation, God comforting us. And the rapture is completely out in some areas that would be completely non-Christian. So that this pre-tribulation tribulational premillennialism, or even post-tribulational premillennialism, that would be rather unchristian, I would say, without again using this word, the P word. Now, there is indeed real war among the people holding millennial views. Now, in here, the premillennial people are very pessimistic, because in their belief, they think that people are beyond remedy. Now, even after Christ, after they have accepted Christ, after Christ has transformed their lives, they believe that they cannot change the world. And so they have a ultra pessimistic view of human nature versus the post-millennial people, because those post-millennial people would consider maybe changing, improving the institutions in this world through preaching the gospel, through educating the people, through bringing people to Christ. The world would be transformed. And when the world is transformed sufficiently, then we will welcome Christ back to this earth. And that would be the second coming. Now, this seems to be closer to the Bible, because indeed, Christ wants us to be the salt and light of this world. For what? Just to sacrifice ourselves to be salt and light? No. Christ wants us to transform this world through our lives, through how we conduct ourselves. And nevertheless, this post-millennial view, as I have pointed out, still needs something extra in order for it to stand. And I will further critique this particular standpoint later on. But it seems that this is closer to the Bible, because this does not denigrate the entire salvation of Christ. But then there is a lot of conflict between this pre- and post-millennial view. The post-millennial view was rather prevalent in, I suppose, the European English-speaking world before the First World War, because people saw that when they change the institutions, when they educate the people, when they spread the gospel, there is indeed real change. But the First World War changes everything, because despite all these things, they fought a war, and then after the First World War, less than 20 years after that, another World War took place, and human nature is seen to be irredeemable. And so this premillennial pessimistic view of human nature would take hold. And people would then argue again about whether they hold to this premillennial or postmillennial view. And I've heard faculty appointments would sometimes be based on this, or leadership in the church, and so on and so forth. And you know who would be most happy to see all this conflict? For something that is quite unnecessary, because as far as I'm concerned, I don't see this in this 20th chapter of Revelation. So it is a figment of one's bloated imagination, and then Satan would be laughing all the way to the bank. Now, in any case, let us take a look at the last millennial view, amillennialism. Amillennialism seems to convey that they don't believe in a millennium, a 1,000-year rule of Christ. In fact, they do. except that they take this figuratively. Christ's millennial reign would not be exactly 1,000 years or literally 1,000 years as the two views before would make you, would tell you, okay? They say the Christ's millennial reign would start at Pentecost. And it makes a lot of sense because Christ has transformed the lives of all these people. And so in a way, symbolically, he may be ruling over this world. He may be reigning. I should use the word reign. And then Christ's reign, however, they say Christ's reign is spiritual because they cannot reconcile all these things that are going on in this world. So they try to say, well, Christ's reign is spiritual and is heavenly. It cannot be taken physically or literally as in the previous views. And the struggle is between good and evil. And this is how they read Revelation. And the reason why I have to go through this millennial view is that this millennialism seems to be a pivotal thing for us to build a framework around Revelation, around our interpretation of Revelation. So this is a pre-millennial view, this post-millennial view, and this amillennial view would be three different frameworks, not only to interpret Revelation 20, but it would also put other so-called events, other things talked about in Revelation with respect in relation to this millennium. Okay, so this is very important. So this amillennial view would see that Revelation talks about the struggle between good and evil. And this good and evil would continue to fight over this world for a long, long time. It's not interminable, but sometimes people would accuse them of looking at good and evil as a permanent feature of this world. However, my critique is that in our interpretation of Revelation, one should not try to over-spiritualize so as to allow things to escape from heaven, to escape to heaven. This is opposite to what we have found in Revelation. Revelation is down to earth. The teachings are very practical, and we can relate to that here on this earth. Is not something up in heaven. So that is important. And when we take a look at Revelation 20 or Revelation and read it too symbolically, then sometimes we run into the danger of spiritualizing things at the expense of understanding the symbols. Now, let me give you an illustration. Just a few weeks ago, someone knowing that I am teaching a course in Revelation gave me a newsletter of a seminary. And in there is an article on how we should read Revelation in light in the current situation when there are so many conflicts and the world looks so gloomy. And after reading the article, I was surprised because this professor talks about how we should appreciate it, how we should be excited emotionally by all the symbols in Revelation. But he does not talk about the meaning of any of this symbols in Revelation. He does not even mention, let's say, the time scales, 1,260 days, 3.5 days, and so on. And it gives me the impression that he is only concerned about showing how wonderful Revelation is for us to get an emotional high, for us to be emotionally responsive to it, without really understanding, without doing the rational analysis before we go to that emotional high. And to many people, without the analysis, one cannot relate to Revelation, and one cannot just live by this emotion, okay? And that also explains the question I have in mind for a long time when I read some commentaries. There are some commentaries that would completely bypass the difficult symbols, like what I mentioned, 3.5 days, 42 months, 1,260 days, as if all these are not important. And I was scratching my head, why and how on earth can they bypass this? Well, because apart from not being able to make sense of this, they take a view that, well, Revelation is symbolic. It's so symbolic that we can relate to it emotionally, and that would be enough. And I take exception to that, okay? Now, okay, enough of all these different millennial views. Now, this is my critique of all the millennial views, and I guess the first thing is that they do not respect Revelation's context. They do not respect Revelation's scope. And I will say a little bit more about that. And then they mix in extra context information like the rapture, and importantly, the second coming, which is biblical, depending on how you interpret Jesus coming. But Jesus has promised to come again, okay? But when you bring it into a chapter that doesn't seem to be talking about the same thing, then you're actually confusing the issue. And none of this will stand out without the extra second coming. Yeah. Without this extra, then the millennium will have to be reinterpreted using a different set of rules. And I would submit that that different set of rules would be to read it in the proper context of Revelation. Now, here, what is the outcome? The result of all this is that we only have a half Jesus. Wow, that is serious. Now just look at this diagram over here. Okay, here it says the first coming of Jesus. That is when Jesus was born, and then he lived, he preached, and then he died on the cross. That would constitute his first coming, and he was on this earth. And what is this? This is eternity. But this is just half of history. What about the history before Christ came? What about the time when Adam and Eve sinned all the way to Christ stood on this earth? We're missing all that. And this is half Jesus. And if you have followed what I talked about, it seems that Revelation has not been talking about Jesus as the person who only is relevant after he walked this earth and died. Okay, Jesus has been working through the law and the prophets in the past, and the law and the prophets happen to be the two witnesses, and that portrayal tells us that Jesus has been ever active, working. And the same goes for the first four seals, because that was the mission that God has entrusted all human beings to look after his creation, and God has given them this particular nature, which is true throughout history. And we cannot be overlooking the first half of this history, during which Jesus was also working. So my major critique is that all these millennial views have a half Jesus. Now, so much for that. So let me then now say how my interpretation differ from all this prevailing millennial views. All these millennial views are based on a timeline, all of them, whereas mine is based on another perspective. So what do I mean by that? Now let me give you a rundown of Revelation again. In Revelation 18, Babylon has been destroyed. Okay. In Revelation 19, the beast and the false prophets have been burned up, not burned up, have been thrown into the fiery lake. And then Satan, starting in chapter 20, Satan is bound for 1,000 years. The beheaded saints would resurrect to reign with Christ. And Christ reigns with the saints for 1,000 years. Satan is let out very briefly to deceive the nations. The universal rebellion against God is prophesied. And then Satan's camp, or the saints' camp, is besieged. Then God broke the siege, destroyed the rebels, and then comes the final judgment. Now, if we consider this as chronology, events happening one after another, then there are certain questions. Who are the remnants being ruled over? Well, obviously, after Babylon has been destroyed, Babylon is the masses, all the people, and then after the heads of this people, the leaders of this people, the political and the religious leaders of this people have been destroyed in chapter 19. There's only some remnant left. Now, these people, according to this timeline, would have come out of Babylon. And in the book of Revelation, there are only two camps, Satan's camp and the Lamb's camp. No one would fall in between the cracks. And so these people coming out of Babylon would be the remnant, and they would be in the saints' camp, right? Okay, now, then if they're in the saints' camp, they are saints. So, and now they are subject to Christ's rule for 1,000 years. Now, imagine you're a sinner before, and now you turn to Christ, you forsake all these previous sins, and now you live, if you live that long, 1,000 years, in Christ's righteous rule. Wow, you believe that you have forgotten all this wickedness in your life, okay? Because Christ has habituated you into his righteousness. So that's amazing. Then, so we have answered the question of who these people are. And why is it necessary to let Satan out after it is being thrown into the fiery lake? Oh, you have to tell me that. There doesn't seem to be an answer. How brief is the little while? Now, I pointed out last time that this little while is a little chronos. It's a little time, tick, 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 tick. It has no significance. It's not appointed time. So how brief is this time? The Bible doesn't give an answer, but it's very brief in relation to this 1,000 years. How can they organize so quickly to oppose God? Now, this is not a funny, facetious question. If saints coming out of Babylon and joining the Lamb, joining Jesus, and they have been habituated into Christ's righteousness for 1,000 years, or their descendants, if they don't live that long, okay? but they have known nothing about evil. They have known everything about righteousness. So they have been so habituated. They would all of a sudden, in this very short time that Satan is allowed to deceive them, they would organize themselves so quickly to oppose God. How quickly? Now, when they organize, they would still go about their ordinary life, but they would sin, and when they sin, they would oppress people. They would shed the blood of the saints. So that would be Babylon again. And then some people from them would rise up politically to oppress the people. That is the first beast again. Some people would listen to Satan and would bring the lies of Satan to the people, and that would be the false prophet. So is Babylon the first and the second beast again? So this is a repeat. This is a repeat. And so the question is, why do you have to repeat that in chapter 18 and 19? This would be repeated ad infinitum, to everlasting. Because if you can allow, if you believe that there is a necessity for 1,000 years, then there is a necessity of another 1,000 years after this first one, and then another 1,000 years. What makes this first 1,000 years so special? Because this 1,000 years would be a repeat of what has gone on before, except that it is confined to 1,000 years. So what prevents it from repeating and repeating ad infinitum? That's the question. And then, where is the saints' camp? According to this chapter, if you take it literally, is in one place, and so the other people are besieging the camp. And what is the purpose of all this? Now, this is what theologians and Bible expositors cannot answer. What is the purpose of this? Okay. Now, let us try to answer this from the perspective angle. From the perspective angle, there is really no remnant. The people have always been there because this 1,000 years would be from the beginning of this world to the end of the world. And during this time, Christ and his witnesses have always tried to transform this world. Okay, they would be witnessing to those who still have not known Christ. And why is it necessary to let out Satan? That is the rule of the game. God is saying that now you have to prove yourself to be moral by rejecting Satan and follow me. Okay. How brief is a little while? Well, this little while is tailored for each person and tailored for each group, for each nation. And this little while would be little whiles throughout history. Okay. And is there organization needed to oppose God? Well, people have been organizing themselves ever since the Tower of Babel, and no special organization is needed. This is what the perspective view is talking about. Okay, the nations are simply the people, and they have been organizing to oppose God. Is this a repeat? No, because it is a spiritual perspective. When I say spiritual, now I do not mean that it is up there in heaven, we cannot relate to. By spiritual, I mean it is a decisional perspective. In chapter 20, people are called to make a decision for or against God, against or for Satan. Okay. And where's the saints' camp? The people who have stood up for God throughout the generation, everywhere in this world, in every corner of this world. What is the purpose of this? Now this, according to this perspective, is to highlight human responsibility for the judgment to come. After all these things, then the Bible talks about the final judgment. Now, so this is a chronological comparison between the timeline understanding and the perspective understanding. So that is the first thing. Then the second thing that we want to talk about is theological. Now again, we have all this Revelation 20 events here. But look, the first question from the timeline is, why is another episode necessary for people before the final judgment? Now this is extremely important because according to the Bible, if we have changed camp, if we have forsaken Babylon, come out of Babylon and join the saints' camp, and we will be in God's grace, and eventually God will lead us to his city, the city of God, right? Why is it necessary to put people through another test before the judgment? Well, yes, people have to be tested again and again, but we are talking about a very major test that everybody needs to go through again. Saints will have, and then the really damaging thing is that why are people predetermined to be destroyed? Because it is prophesied in this timeline that these people coming out of Babylon, the saints, some of them will fall away and would organize themselves to oppose Christ in the end. I mean, and this is a prophecy. It is certain that a fraction of these people, saints, accepted by God, fully accepted by God because they have joined the saints' camp, would fall away. Why? What does this say about the nature of God? Well, my answer is, he is sadistically wrathful. God is a sadist, okay? According to this view, what does this say about the efficacy of Jesus' salvation for his creation? Now, the first question that I have up here is whether Jesus' salvation for us as individuals is sufficient. But here, I'm asking another question. What does it say about the efficacy of Jesus' salvation for his creation? Since in this chapter 20, it seems that after all these things have been destroyed, Revelation 20 only sees God, Satan, and humans. And last time I have cataloged 24 differences showing that all these mundane things, all these earthly things, all these creational things, creatures, trees, and all those things are no longer talked about in chapter 20. Chapter 20 seems to have stripped all this away. And that gives people a wrong impression that at the end, it really doesn't matter. It is just Christ or God and his people. Salvation doesn't really matter. So does it mean that Jesus' salvation will only extend to people? And in some of the misunderstandings that we encounter, extend only to the souls, the spirit of these people, because it is only our spirit that is saved, okay? There is no bodily resurrection. Well, let us try to answer this from the perspective angle. It is not another episode along some timeline, but a purposeful perspective. So there is really no need for another episode. God has accepted us into his camp, and with God's acceptance, that is enough. We will not have to be put through the grinder again, because we have already made our choice for God. Now, why are people determined to be destroyed after Christ's righteous reign? Well, Christ has always wanted to rule over this world righteously. According to this perspective, only sinners are being defeated, and there is no predetermination. There is no how would I say? People are not predestined to eventually rebel against God. There's no such thing as far as the perspective is concerned. God has always been working to rule this world righteously. Okay. What does this say about the nature of God? Well, in chapter 20, because it's another perspective, it shows again that Jesus is reigning with the saints, and Jesus is the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow, and forever. And finally, Jesus' death and resurrection is sufficient for saving his entire creation, starting with people, to bring hope to creation. So this perspective is in harmony with all that we know from the previous chapters of Revelation. Now, then, let me try to quickly conclude this. The two perspectives that I talk about in Revelation would complement and reinforce each other. Now, they would complement each other like this. There is this part, which is the first, the mundane perspective, starting from chapter 4 to 19, and then in chapter 21 and 22, it reverts to this mundane description. Chapter 20 stands out as a spiritual perspective. And so what is the key to the well-being of God's creation? According to, let's say, the spiritual perspective first. Every person now represented by nation, because here Satan always deceives the nations. And why is that so? Because the nation is not really a nation as we know it. Because as I mentioned, before, when the Bible talks about all the people, it would Revelation would say the peoples, the tribes, the tongues, the nations, and so on. But when it comes to chapter 20, everything is compressed to nations. So nations would be all the people, individuals, nations, and groups, okay? Every person, according to chapter 20, would have to make a faithful decision, or faithful decisions for or against God. And eventually, each is judged by the deeds. But this is limited by a spiritual perspective, and it does not extend to further description. And this extension of further describing what this means is in the mundane perspective. And in there, it talks about what? The good creation, but then there is need for redemption. There's the 4 living creatures, but there are 4 destructive forces, good 4 living creatures, and then 4 destructive forces. And then there are 4 destructive trumpets, but God would halt his wrath, halt his judgment, and then God would bring Jesus' resurrection. So in a way, they complement each other. They do not overlap. One is this concerning the decision, and the other would concern how human nature would manifest itself and what God would be doing. And then what is the outcome of God's working with the people for his creation? Now here in chapter 20, the resurrected saints will be reigning with Christ. And then that is set against the besieger being destroyed by fire. So that is the outcome of this drama. And so in chapter 12 to 19, we see creation being cleansed through the saints' effort, because after the Lord of the Sabbath is resurrected, that precipitates this struggle in which creation is being cleansed. And also, when the people cleanse creation, it is also seen as God administering his wrath, pouring his wrath on the opposition. And so you have the dragon chasing the woman, you have the two camps in opposition and God's wrath, and Satan's camp would eventually self-destruct, and then comes the New Jerusalem, okay? So those are the complementary aspects. Again, they don't overlap. But here, you see, there are overlapping themes, reinforcing themes. In the mundane perspective, which comes first, there are the locusts tormenting people for 5 months, but God has limited that for 5 months. Why? Because God is protecting the people, and God halts the 7 thunders. And then this tells us in the spiritual perspective that God finds Satan. And what's the reason for that? To protect the people, okay? So that people can have a breathing room and they have no excuse for not turning to God. And then God is working consistently and relentlessly throughout. Now, this is very interesting. Jesus in chapter 11 stands right in the middle of history, splitting history into, if you like, the Old Testament and New Testament era. Okay, but then in chapter 20, Christ is simply reigning with his saints. Christ has always been there. Now, even this very pivotal work of his death and resurrection is not mentioned. The saints have resurrected, but Christ's resurrection is not repeated. And so it shows us how Jesus has been working throughout history, reigning with his saints. This is amazing, okay? Because it seems that the most important thing, Jesus' death and resurrection, has suffused the entire span of history. And then God's work is centered on Jesus Christ. Now, we've seen that the Lord of the Sabbath is seen working throughout history. And here the saints are reigning with Christ throughout history, in life and even in death, okay? And it's still Christ here. Now, Jesus' victory is seminally complete. What do I mean by that? Jesus' resurrection has brought about the downfall of Satan. But then, that is the seminal victory. The cleansing continues with the saints. And here, when it comes to the spiritual perspective, yes, every person throughout history will still have to make a decision for God. And this struggle continues. So they reinforce each other. And finally, this is really in black and white. What started all this is Satan's falsehood. It goes all the way back to Genesis 3, when Satan tempted Adam and Eve. So it starts, and then it is talked about in the 5th trumpet when the locust would come out and deceive people. And then in the fifth bowl, the opposition is so deceived by their own lies, because the kingdom of the beast is darkened. They cannot see the truth. They believe in their own lies, and they have gone way beyond, I would say, redemption. Okay, but the saints are to combat that by the blood of the Lamb, the testimony of the word, and they do not even consider their lives as important for sacrificing for God, and they hold on to this truth. Okay, no lies are found in them. In here, Satan is again described as the source of all evil. And what is this evil? It's falsehood, it's deception. Okay, and people will have to reject it. It's black and white. Any further saying would be from Satan. any attempt to try to whitewash your lives would be from Satan also. Okay, so we see a lot of reinforcing themes between the two perspectives in the book of Revelation. So that brings us to a close on the discussion of the first 20 chapters of Revelation. And next time we're going to talk about something more beautiful in a way. So what are the lessons being learned? Contextual observations are crucial to grasping Revelation. We should not bring in all this extra context things. So read Revelation according to the context. And there are two complementary aspects. There is the mundane aspect with layer by layer elaborations, and the decisional spiritual aspects to complement the previous narration. So, and hopefully with this framework in mind, and when you go back and reread Revelation, you'll be able to appreciate Revelation a lot better. So next time, read Revelation 21 and 22, the last two chapters, and we'll cover that the next time. And find out how the city of God is described from two angles. And with that, I'm going to close the session and open the floor again to discussion. And let me